Alexander the Great, the man who conquered the world. The thunder before the storm. The night sky over Pella erupted in violence. Thunder rolled across the Macedonian capital like the drums of approaching war, and lightning split the darkness in jagged white scars. It was July 356 BC, and in the royal palace, Queen Olympias labored to bring forth her child. The air hung thick with summer heat and anticipation, while outside the palace walls, the city held its breath. In that same hour, nearly 1,000 miles to the south, flames consumed the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the magnificent structure had stood for centuries as a testament to human devotion and architectural brilliance. Now it burned, reduced to ash and memory in a single catastrophic night. The priests would later claim that the goddess herself had been absent, attending the birth of one who would reshape the world. When the child finally emerged into the flickering torchlight of the royal chamber, Olympias held him close and saw in his eyes something that chilled and thrilled her in equal measure. This was no ordinary prince. The lightning that had illuminated his arrival seemed to pulse in his very blood, a restless energy that would never find peace, never accept limits, never stop reaching for the horizon. King Philip II received the news while campaigning in Thrace. 3 messengers arrived in quick succession, each bearing tidings of triumph. His general Parmenion had defeated the Illyrians, his horse had won at the Olympic Games, and his wife had delivered a son. Philip, a man who understood omens and the weight of destiny, smiled grimly. The gods, it seemed, had granted him an heir on a day when victory crowned every endeavor. He named the boy Alexander. Confiscated could not have known, standing there in his military tent with mud still clinging to his boots, what forces he had helped set in motion. The child born that stormy night would surpass him in every way imaginable. Where Philip conquered Greece, Alexander would conquer the known world. Where Philip dreamed of empire, Alexander would build one that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. And where Philip's legacy would fade into history's margins, Alexander's name would echo through the millennia, spoken with reverence and wonder by those who came after. Mistakenly, in 356 BC, was not the superpower it would become. It was a kingdom on the periphery of Greek civilization, looked down upon by the sophisticated city-states of Athens and Sparta. The Greeks considered Macedonians barely civilized, their dialect crude, their customs rough. But what Macedonia lacked in culture, it possessed in raw potential. The land was fertile, the people hardy, and under Philip's leadership, the army was becoming something the Greek world had never seen. Philip himself was a remarkable man, scarred from countless battles, blinded in one eye during the siege of Methone, limping from a spear wound that had shattered his leg. He had transformed Macedonian warfare by introducing the sarissa, a pike nearly 20 feet long that gave his infantry formations unprecedented reach. He had drilled his soldiers until they moved as one organism, the phalanx becoming an irresistible force that crushed everything in its path. Yet Philip understood that conquest required more than military might. He married strategically, taking wives from rival kingdoms to forge alliances and neutralize threats. Olympias was his 4th wife, a princess of Epirus, a land to the west of Macedonia. She was beautiful, intelligent, passionate, and dangerous. She practiced the old mystery religions, worshipped serpents, and claimed descent from Achilles himself, the greatest warrior of Greek legend. From his first moments, Alexander lived in a world of ambition and violence, of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals. The royal court of Pella was a cauldron of intrigue, where Philip's many wives plotted for their children's futures and nobles jockeyed for position and favor. Olympias guarded her son fiercely, whispering to him that he was destined for greatness, that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself, king of the gods. Misunderstanding this, or simply planted the seed to fuel his ambition, the result was the same. Alexander grew up believing he was touched by divinity, that the blood of heroes and gods flowed in his veins, that ordinary limits did not apply to him. This belief would drive him to achievements that defied comprehension. It would also drive him to excesses that shocked even his hardened veterans. The storm that had announced his birth did not abate. It followed him through his life, thunder always on the horizon, lightning illuminating his path. And on that July night in 356 BC, as Olympias held her newborn son and whispered promises of glory into his tiny ear, the ancient world stood poised on the brink of transformation. No one yet knew that this child would never lose a battle. No one imagined he would be dead before his 33rd birthday, having conquered more territory than any man in history. No one could foresee that 2,000 years later, his name would still be spoken with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The storm had arrived, and its name was Alexander. Forged in fire. The boy who would be king knew hardship before he knew comfort. Philip believed that soft princes made weak kings, so he placed his son in the care of Leonidas, a stern relative of Olympias from Epirus. Leonidas was a man carved from granite, humorless and uncompromising. He believed that royal blood meant nothing if not tempered by discipline and suffering. Under his supervision, young Alexander endured a childhood that would have broken lesser spirits. Breaking came early in the royal household. While other aristocratic children slept in soft beds, Alexander was roused before sunrise for forced marches across the Macedonian hills. Leonidas rationed his food, believing that hunger sharpened the mind and strengthened the will. The boy learned to appreciate the simplest meal, to find satisfaction in a crust of bread and a sip of water after hours of grueling exercise. He learned that the body could be pushed far beyond what the mind thought possible, that pain was temporary, but weakness was permanent. Leonidas taught him to ride, to fight, to endure. He taught him that a king must lead from the front, must share the hardships of his men, must never ask them to face what he himself would not face. These lessons would stay with Alexander throughout his life. Years later, campaigning in the deserts of Persia, he would refuse water when his soldiers had none. Marching through the snows of the Hindu Kush, he would sleep on the ground alongside his men. This was Leonidas's gift, harsh though it was. But the boy also had another tutor, Lysimachus of Acarnania, who recognized that Alexander possessed not just physical courage, but a soaring imagination. Lysimachus taught through stories and role-play, and he noticed how the boy's eyes blazed when he heard tales of ancient heroes. Alexander was particularly entranced by the Iliad, Homer's epic of the Trojan War. He memorized passages, reciting them with passionate intensity. He identified completely with Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, who chose glory over long life and whose name echoed through the ages. Olympias encouraged this identification. She told him again and again that Achilles was his ancestor, that the same divine blood that made Achilles invincible flowed in his veins. She told him he was destined for immortal glory, that the gods themselves watched his every move. Whether this was her genuine belief or calculated manipulation mattered little. The effect was profound. Alexander grew up with an unshakable conviction that he was marked by fate, that ordinary rules and ordinary limits did not apply to him. Patriotic was tested when he was about 10 years old. A horse trader from Thessaly arrived at the court, offering to sell Philip a magnificent black stallion. The animal was extraordinary, powerful and spirited, but also wild and dangerous. Philip watched as his best horsemen attempted to mount the beast. One after another, they were thrown violently to the ground. The horse reared and kicked, eyes rolling white with fury, nostrils flaring. Philip, disgusted at having his time wasted with an unrideable animal, ordered the trader to take the horse away. But Alexander had been watching carefully, and he saw something the others had missed. The horse was not vicious or mad. It was frightened by its own shadow, panicking each time it caught sight of the dark shape moving beneath it. As the handlers moved to lead the stallion away, the boy stepped forward. "It's a shame to lose such a fine horse because no one knows how to handle him," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Philip turned, surprised. "You think you can do better than these men?" "I think I can," Alexander replied, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. The courtiers laughed. Here was a boy barely into his teens, claiming he could master a beast that had defeated grown men and experienced horsemen. But something in Alexander's eyes stopped Philip's mockery before it began. The king saw determination there, absolute confidence, and he nodded slowly. "Very well, but if you fail, you'll pay for the horse yourself." Alexander approached the stallion slowly, speaking softly, letting the animal become accustomed to his presence. Then, with a deft movement, he turned the horse toward the sun so it could no longer see its own shadow. The stallion calmed almost immediately. Alexander stroked its neck, whispered in its ear, and then, in one fluid motion, vaulted onto its back. The horse tensed, but did not throw him. Instead, feeling the confidence and control of its rider, it began to move. Alexander gave it its head, and the stallion exploded into a gallop. Together they thundered across the training ground, horse and rider moving as one, until finally Alexander wheeled the animal around and rode back to where his father stood. The courtyard had fallen absolutely silent. Philip's eyes gleamed with tears as he looked at his son, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Stroke Bucephalus was Alexander's constant companion. They were inseparable, the boy and the magnificent black stallion, and together they would ride into legend. Bucephalus would carry Alexander through every major battle of his life, would cross deserts and mountains, would swim rivers and charge into enemy formations. Their bond was so complete that no one else could ride the horse. It would bow only to Alexander, lowering its great head so he could mount, and would allow no other hand to guide it. When Alexander turned 13, Philip made a decision that would shape not just his son's future, but the future of Western civilization. He hired Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, to be Alexander's tutor. Going Aristotle was 41 years old, already renowned for his brilliance, a former student of Plato who had spent decades studying everything from politics to physics, from ethics to biology. Philip offered him generous payment and promised to rebuild his hometown of Stagira, which had been destroyed in war. In return, Aristotle would educate the young prince and a select group of Macedonian noble youths at a secluded estate in Mieza, far from the distractions and intrigues of the court. For 3 years, Alexander studied under the philosopher in the tranquil gardens and colonnaded walkways of the Temple of the Nymphs. Aristotle taught him philosophy, literature, medicine, and science. He opened the boy's mind to the vastness of human knowledge, to the power of logic and reason, to the beauty of the natural world. They dissected plants and animals. They debated questions of ethics and politics. They read poetry and history. But Aristotle also taught lessons that Alexander would later reject. The philosopher believed in natural hierarchy, in the superiority of Greeks over barbarians, in the rightness of slavery. He told Alexander that non-Greeks lacked true reason and culture, that they existed to serve their betters. These ideas were common in the Greek world, accepted without question by most educated men. Alexander absorbed the knowledge, but questioned the prejudices. Even as a teenager, he possessed a remarkable openness to other cultures, a curiosity about foreign peoples that his tutor did not share. This would later manifest in his policy of cultural fusion, his adoption of Persian customs, his insistence on treating conquered peoples with respect rather than contempt. In this, the student would surpass the teacher, seeing possibilities that even Aristotle's great mind could not imagine. The education at Mieza created bonds between Alexander and his fellow students that would last throughout his campaigns. Among them was Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest friend and most trusted companion. There was also Ptolemy, who would one day rule Egypt as pharaoh. There was Cassander, who would later return to rule Macedonia. These boys, learning together in the peaceful groves of Mieza, would one day command armies and carve up Alexander's empire among themselves. Pennsylvania would betrayal and division lay in the future. For now, they were simply young men, filled with dreams and energy, absorbing knowledge and preparing for greatness under the guidance of the greatest teacher in Greece. Alexander threw himself into his studies with characteristic intensity. He never did anything by half measures. When he read obsessively. When he debated, he argued with passionate conviction. When he learned, he demanded to know not just facts, but underlying principles. Aristotle later said that he had never taught a more brilliant or more difficult student. Alexander questioned everything, challenged assumptions, pushed boundaries. He wanted to know why things were as they were, whether they could be different, what possibilities lay beyond current knowledge. His mind was as restless as his body, always moving, always reaching, never satisfied with easy answers or conventional wisdom. At 16, his education was interrupted when Philip left to campaign in Thrace and left Alexander as regent of Macedonia. This was an extraordinary responsibility for one so young, but Philip recognized his son's capabilities. The boy had been trained in warfare since childhood, had studied strategy and tactics, and possessed natural leadership that men responded to instinctively. The appointment was vindicated when the Mede tribe in northeastern Macedonia rebelled. Without hesitation, Alexander gathered an army and marched against them. He defeated the rebels in swift, decisive combat, captured their capital, drove them from Macedonian territory, and founded a military colony called Alexandropolis in the conquered region. All this at 16 years old, his first independent command, his first military victory. 2 years later came an even greater test. In 338 BC, Philip confronted the combined armies of Athens and Thebes at Chaeronea, a battle that would decide the fate of Greece. Philip gave Alexander command of the cavalry on the left wing, facing the legendary Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 warriors who had never been defeated in battle. Alexander was 18 years old, and this was the moment he had been preparing for all his life. The training under Leonidas, the lessons from Aristotle, the taming of Bucephalus, the victory over the Mede, everything had led to this battlefield, to this responsibility, to this opportunity to prove himself worthy of his heritage. When Philip gave the signal to attack, Alexander led his cavalry in a thundering charge against the Theban position. The Sacred Band held firm, their discipline legendary, their courage unmatched. The battle raged for hours, brutal and desperate, the issue in doubt. But Alexander fought with the fury of Achilles, with the skill of a veteran, and with the tactical brilliance that would later conquer empires. He probed for weaknesses, adapted to the enemy's responses, coordinated his cavalry with the infantry phalanx, and finally, when the moment came, he broke through the Theban lines. Combating the Sacred Band fought to the last man, refusing to retreat, and when the battle was over, all 300 lay dead on the field. The Athenians and their allies fled in disorder. Greece lay at Philip's mercy, and Alexander had earned his place as a warrior worthy of his famous ancestors. Confiscated, that night, Philip elevated his son to the rank of general and proclaimed him his heir. But the relationship between father and son was already strained, and it would only grow worse in the months to come. Philip took another wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, niece of his general Attalus, and at the wedding feast, Attalus drunkenly toasted to the hope that this marriage would produce a legitimate heir to Macedonia. Alexander, furious at the insult to both himself and his mother, hurled his wine cup at Attalus. Philip, drunk and enraged, drew his sword and lurched toward his son, only to trip and fall flat on his face. Alexander stood over his fallen father and said coldly, "Look, men, here is the one who prepares to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." Mother and son were exiled, Olympias to Epirus and Alexander to Illyria, though both returned within months. But the damage was done. The trust between Philip and Alexander had fractured, and seeds of suspicion had been planted that would bloom into dark theories when Philip met his end. The boy forged in fire had become a man of iron will, brilliant mind, and boundless ambition. He had tasted victory and found it sweet. He had faced death and discovered he did not fear it. He had been told all his life that he was destined for greatness, and he believed it with absolute certainty. Now he needed only the opportunity to prove it. That opportunity would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would arrive drenched in blood. Blood and succession. Captain 336 BC, the ancient capital of Aigai. The theatre filled with dignitaries from across Greece, nobles from Macedonia and beyond, all gathered to witness a celebration befitting a great king. Philip was marrying his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympias's brother, forging yet another alliance through bloodline and ceremony. It was to be a spectacle of Macedonian power, a demonstration that Philip's kingdom had risen to dominate all of Greece. The morning began with sacrifices to the gods and processions through the city. Musicians played, poets recited verses in Philip's honor, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Philip had reason to feel triumphant. At 46, he had accomplished what no Macedonian king before him had dreamed possible. He had unified Greece under Macedonian leadership, formed the League of Corinth, and prepared to lead a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. An advance force of 10,000 men under General Parmenion was already in Asia Minor, preparing the way. As the ceremonies moved into the theatre, Philip made a decision that would cost him his life. To show his confidence and accessibility, to demonstrate that he trusted the Greek dignitaries present, he ordered his bodyguards to stand back and entered the theatre with only his companions flanking him. He walked without armor, wearing white, a target in every sense of the word. From the crowd, a man moved with sudden, terrible purpose. Pausanias, one of Philip's 7 bodyguards, a man who had stood at the king's side in battle and shared his confidence at court. He had concealed a Celtic dagger beneath his cloak, and now he drew it in one swift motion and plunged it between Philip's ribs. The king gasped, staggered, and fell. Blood spread across the white fabric of his ceremonial robes. For a moment, the theatre froze in shock, unable to process what had just occurred. Then chaos erupted. Screams filled the air, people surged away from the fallen king, guards shouted contradictory orders. Pausanias turned and ran. He had positioned horses at the city gates, planning his escape meticulously. He had perhaps 50 yards to cover, 50 yards to reach those horses and flee Macedonia forever. But in his haste, his foot caught on a vine root, and he fell sprawling. Before he could rise, 3 of Philip's other bodyguards, Perdiccas, Leonatus, and Attalus, were upon him. Their spears rose and fell, and Pausanias died there in the dirt, his blood mingling with the blood of the king he had murdered. By the time the physicians reached Philip, he was gone. The king who had reshaped Macedonia and Greece, who had prepared to humble the vast Persian Empire, died on the floor of a theatre in his ancestral city, murdered by one of his own men. He had achieved so much and had so much more yet to do, but fate and a dagger had ended everything in one violent moment. The assassin was dead, silenced forever, unable to answer questions or name accomplices. This convenient death would fuel speculation for centuries. Some said Pausanias acted alone, driven by personal grievance. Years earlier, he had been sexually assaulted by servants of General Attalus, and when he sought justice, Philip had given him promotion instead of satisfaction. The shame and anger had festered, growing into an obsession that led to murder. But others whispered of darker conspiracies. Olympias was mentioned, the scorned wife who had seen her position threatened by Philip's latest marriage. She had motive and opportunity, and her behavior after the murder was suspicious. She placed a crown on Pausanias's corpse, erected a tomb over his remains, and ordered annual sacrifices in his honor. These were not the actions of a woman mourning her husband or shocked by his death. Some pointed to Alexander himself. At 20 years old, he had seen his position as heir questioned, his mother exiled, his legitimacy challenged. Philip's newest wife might bear a son free from Olympias's foreign blood, a son whom certain factions would prefer as successor. And Alexander was present at Aigi when the murder occurred, able to act swiftly in the aftermath. The Persian king Darius was another possibility. Philip's invasion of Asia was imminent, and Persia had every reason to eliminate the threat before it could materialize. Gold could buy assassins, and Pausanias might have been merely a tool wielded by Persian hands. Or perhaps it was simpler and sadder than any conspiracy. Perhaps a troubled young man, humiliated and denied justice, had lashed out at the most powerful target available, seeking in murder the recognition and revenge he could not obtain through proper channels. Perhaps Pausanias acted alone, his grievances genuine, his rage his own. We will never know with certainty. The historical sources contradict each other, shaped by the political agendas of those who recorded them. Enemies of Olympias blamed her. Enemies of Alexander suggested his involvement. Persian sources are lost to time. The truth died with Pausanias in the dust of Aigi, and 2,000 years of speculation have brought us no closer to definitive answers. What is certain is what happened next. Within hours of Philip's death, the Macedonian army and nobility acclaimed Alexander as king. There was no debate, no delay, no competing claim. Some historians see this as evidence of a conspiracy, suggesting that only careful planning could produce such swift consensus. Others see it as simple recognition of reality. Alexander was Philip's designated heir, proven in battle, trained since childhood, and possessing qualities that inspired immediate loyalty. Whatever the reason for the speed, Alexander moved with ruthless efficiency to secure his position. He was 20 years old, untested as a ruler, and surrounded by potential threats. Several members of the court who might challenge him died quickly and conveniently. The sons of Aeropus of Lyncestis, commanders who had been disgraced by Philip, were executed for alleged involvement in the conspiracy. Other nobles who had shown ambition or harbored grudges found themselves facing accusations and trials that invariably ended in their deaths. Alexander's first acts as king revealed the man he would become. He was capable of great generosity and great cruelty, often in quick succession. He was politically astute, understanding when to show mercy and when to show strength. He was decisive, never paralyzed by doubt, always moving forward, even when the correct course was unclear. And he possessed an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in his followers, to make them believe in his vision, to convince them that the impossible was merely difficult. He immediately faced rebellion from the Greek city-states, who saw Philip's death as an opportunity to reclaim their independence. The news spread like wildfire. The Macedonian king was dead, killed by one of his own guards, and his successor was a boy barely out of adolescence. Thebes revolted. Athens considered its options. The carefully constructed alliances that Philip had forged through years of warfare and diplomacy seemed ready to crumble. Sanders' response was swift and terrible. He marched south with an army moving at speeds that shocked his enemies. Before the Greek city-states could coordinate their resistance, Before their armies could even fully mobilize, Alexander was at their gates. Most capitulated immediately, overawed by his speed and the size of his force. The League of Corinth, somewhat reluctantly, reconfirmed him as its leader and commander for the planned campaign against Persia. But Thebes, emboldened by false rumors that Alexander had been killed in fighting to the north, declared independence and besieged the Macedonian garrison in their city. Alexander responded with overwhelming force. He took the city in a brutal assault, and what followed was a lesson in the cost of rebellion. Thebes was systematically destroyed. The city that had produced some of Greece's greatest poets and philosophers, that had fielded the legendary sacred band, was razed to the ground. Its population was sold into slavery. Only the house of the poet Pindar and the temples were spared. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves through Greece. Here was a message written in rubble and ash: resist and be annihilated. The other city-states got the message. Athens, which had been considering revolt, hurriedly sent ambassadors pledging loyalty and friendship. Sparta, proud and isolated, watched warily, but did not challenge the new king. In less than a year, Alexander had transformed from prince to king, had crushed rebellion, had secured his throne, and had established himself as a force to be feared. He had shown he could be merciful to those who submitted and merciless to those who defied him. He had demonstrated strategic brilliance, political acumen, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. Now he turned his attention to the great project his father had begun, the campaign that had been interrupted by an assassin's dagger. The Persian Empire sprawled across 3 continents, wealthy beyond imagination, fielding armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It had stood for 2 centuries, had humiliated Greek invasions in the past, and seemed eternal in its power. Alexander intended to conquer it all, not to merely raid its western provinces, not to simply free the Greek cities on its borders, but to overthrow the great king himself and claim his throne. It was an ambition that bordered on madness, a goal so audacious that even Alexander's supporters must have privately doubted it was possible. But Alexander did not doubt. He never doubted. His entire life had prepared him for this moment, and he moved forward with the absolute confidence of a man who believed destiny was on his side. The gods had marked him at birth with thunder and lightning. His ancestor Achilles had chosen glory over long life. His teacher Aristotle had educated him in the wisdom of the ages. His father Philip had given him the finest army in the world. Now it was time to prove he was worthy of it all. Time to march into Asia and write his name across the sky in letters of fire. Time to become Alexander the Great. Breaking at Aigai had barely dried when he gave the order to march. 35,000 men, Macedonians and Greeks, cavalry and infantry, siege engineers and supply trains, the most formidable military force ever assembled by a Greek king. They marched to the Hellespont, to the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, and there Alexander made his preparations. He was about to cross into legend, and the world would never be the same. The invasion begins. Spring, 334 BC, the Hellespont. Alexander stood at the prow of his ship as it crossed the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, wind whipping his cloak behind him, eyes fixed on the distant shore. Around him, hundreds of vessels transported his army across the waters that separated the known world from the great unknown of the Persian Empire. The waves were the same waves that Agamemnon's fleet had crossed to Troy, and Alexander was intensely aware of the symbolism. He was dressed in full armor, wearing the sacred arms of Achilles that he had taken from the temple at Troy. In his mind, he was following in the footsteps of heroes, continuing a story that had begun centuries before. When the ship neared the Asian shore, he hurled his spear into the beach, claiming the continent as his by right of conquest. Then he leaped into the surf, the first Macedonian to set foot in Asia, and waded ashore with water spraying around him. Tangled, the army followed, 35,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, flowing from the ships in organized waves. They established a beachhead without opposition and then marched inland toward the ancient city of Troy. Alexander had to visit the ruins, had to pay homage to his legendary ancestor Achilles, had to draw strength and inspiration from the site of literature's most famous war. At Troy, he performed sacrifices at the supposed tomb of Achilles and accepted from the temple's priests the shield that was said to have belonged to the hero. He raced naked through the ruins in honor of Achilles and Patroclus, his companion Hephaestion running beside him, and the message was clear. This campaign would echo that ancient glory, would be worthy of epic poetry, would be remembered forever. But sentiment and symbolism could not win battles, and the first real test of Alexander's military genius was already approaching. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor, the regional governors who controlled the western provinces, had assembled an army at the river Granicus and were waiting to crush this Greek invasion before it could properly begin. The Granicus was approximately 60 feet wide, with a strong current and steep banks, a natural defensive position that the Persians had strengthened by positioning their cavalry along the far shore. Behind them stood their Greek mercenary infantry, professional soldiers who fought for pay and had no particular loyalty to Persia, but were formidable warriors nonetheless. Alexander's senior general Parmenion advised caution. The river crossing would be difficult. The Macedonians would be vulnerable as they climbed the far bank, and the enemy held every advantage of terrain and position. Better to wait, to find another crossing point, to not risk everything on a frontal assault across a defended river. Alexander rejected the advice. Delay showed weakness, and he needed to establish his reputation immediately. He needed the enemy to fear him, his own men to believe in him, and the watching world to understand that something unprecedented was happening. So he ordered the attack to begin that very afternoon. He positioned himself on the right wing with his elite companion cavalry, the best horsemen in his army, nobles and officers who had trained since childhood to fight from horseback. The center held the phalanx, bristling with their long sarissa pikes, an almost impenetrable wall of bronze and iron and wood. The left wing held the Thessalian cavalry and allied troops. When the trumpets sounded, Alexander personally led the first charge across the river. He rode Bucephalus directly into the current, the great black horse surging through the water, while arrows and javelins fell around them like deadly rain. The Macedonian cavalry followed their king, plunging into the river with war cries echoing off the banks. The Persian cavalry countercharged, slamming into the Macedonians as they struggled up the steep bank. The fighting was savage and desperate. Horses screaming, men falling, weapons clanging on armor and shields. Alexander was in the thick of it, his white plume making him an obvious target, and the Persians recognized him and pressed toward him, trying to kill the Macedonian king and end the invasion in a single blow. A Persian noble named Spithridates charged Alexander and swung his sword with tremendous force. The blade sheared through Alexander's helmet and cut into his scalp, and for a moment it seemed the campaign would end there, in the mud and blood of the Granicus. But before Spithridates could strike again, Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's officers and the brother of his childhood nurse, drove his spear through the Persian's back. Blood streaming down his face, Alexander continued fighting with wild abandon. He seemed possessed by some furious energy, heedless of danger, seeking out the enemy's strongest warriors and challenging them directly. His courage infected the Macedonians around him, and they pressed forward with renewed ferocity, climbing the bank, pushing back the Persian cavalry, creating space for more troops to cross. When enough Macedonians had reached the far bank, the phalanx began its advance. The Greek mercenaries, seeing the Persian cavalry falling back, tried to negotiate surrender, offering to switch sides if Alexander would spare them. He refused. These were Greeks fighting for Persia against a Greek king, and he wanted to send a message that such betrayal would not be tolerated. He ordered his forces to surround the mercenaries and cut them down. The slaughter was terrible. The Greek mercenaries fought with desperate courage, knowing they would receive no mercy, and inflicted heavy casualties on the Macedonians before being overwhelmed. Of the thousands who had fought for Persia, only a handful survived to be taken prisoner and sent back to Macedonia in chains, a warning to any other Greeks who considered selling their swords to the enemy. The Battle of the Granicus lasted less than 2 hours, but its effects rippled across the entire region. The Persian regional commanders had been killed or fled, their army shattered, their authority broken. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, which had been ruled by Persia for generations, now saw an opportunity for freedom and opened their gates to Alexander as a liberator. He marched south along the coast, city after city, surrendering or being taken by storm. Sardis, the wealthy capital of Lydia, surrendered without a fight. Ephesus welcomed him as a hero. Miletus resisted and was besieged and captured. Halicarnassus, defended by the Greek mercenary general Memnon, held out for months before finally falling. With each victory, Alexander's legend grew. His soldiers began to believe he was invincible, blessed by the gods, incapable of defeat. The Persian king Darius III, far away in the capitals of Susa and Persepolis, received increasingly alarming reports about this young Macedonian who moved with unprecedented speed and fought with seemingly supernatural courage. But Darius did not yet understand the threat. He had inherited an empire that had stood for 2 centuries, that stretched from Egypt to India, that commanded resources and manpower beyond anything Greece could match. He thought this invasion would be like previous Greek raids, brief, limited, ultimately unsuccessful. He expected his satraps to handle the problem, to drive these invaders back across the Hellespont and restore order. Only when Alexander spent his first winter in Asia, securing his conquests and preparing for the next campaign season, did Darius begin to grasp that this was something different. This was not a raid. This was not a punitive expedition. This was an attempt at total conquest, led by a commander who thought in terms of empires rather than provinces. And so Darius made his decision. He would take personal command of the imperial army and march west to meet this Macedonian upstart in battle. The great king would crush this invasion himself and remind the world that Persia's power was absolute. Striped confrontation would come in the mountain passes of southern Turkey, at a place called Issus, and it would change everything. But first, Alexander had to survive the winter, had to keep his army fed and paid, had to maintain discipline and morale while preparing for the greatest challenge of his young life. He was 22 years old and had already achieved more than most generals managed in a lifetime. He had crossed into Asia, won his first major battle, captured dozens of cities, and established himself as a force that could not be ignored. The first phase of his campaign was complete, but it was just the beginning. The real test lay ahead, when he would face not regional governors, but the great king himself. Not a provincial army, but the full might of the Persian Empire. Everything he had accomplished so far would mean nothing if he could not win that confrontation. Alexander did not fear the coming battle. Fear was an emotion he seemed incapable of experiencing. He had been training for this his entire life, had been told since childhood that he was destined for greatness, and he believed it with absolute certainty. So he drilled his army through the winter, planned his strategy, gathered intelligence about the enemy's movements, and waited for spring to come. When the snows melted and the passes opened, he would march east and find Darius, and prove to the world that destiny was real and that his name belonged alongside Achilles and Heracles in the pantheon of immortal heroes. The invasion had begun, and there would be no turning back until one king or the other lay defeated. The ancient world watched and waited to see who would emerge victorious from the coming storm. Confronting the Great King, November 333 BC. The coastal plain near Issus. Darius III, great king of Persia, king of kings, ruler of an empire that spanned 3 continents, had made a critical miscalculation. He had led his massive army through the mountain passes, intending to meet Alexander somewhere in the open plains where Persian numbers would prove decisive. But through a combination of misdirection, speed, and blind luck, Alexander had slipped past him, and now Darius found his army positioned behind the Macedonians, cutting their supply lines. It seemed like a brilliant tactical achievement, but it was actually a disaster in disguise. Darius's army, perhaps 100,000 strong, was now crowded onto a narrow coastal plain where numbers meant nothing and maneuverability was severely limited. The Persian king had effectively trapped himself, forced to fight on terrain that negated every advantage he possessed. When Alexander received news of the Persian position, he could hardly believe his fortune. He immediately turned his army around and marched back toward Issus, eager for battle, confident that the gods had delivered his enemy into his hands. The two armies collided on the banks of the Pinarus River, and the battle that followed would determine the fate of empires. Darius positioned himself in the center of his line, surrounded by his royal guard and Greek mercenaries, the most disciplined and dangerous troops he commanded. His cavalry massed on both flanks, and his infantry, drawn from every corner of the empire, filled the space between. It was a conventional formation for the time, strong and balanced, but it lacked the flexibility and coordination that Philip had drilled into the Macedonian army. Alexander arranged his forces with tactical brilliance. The phalanx held the center, a moving fortress of bristling pikes. The Thessalian cavalry anchored the left wing under Parmenian's command. And Alexander himself, on Bucephalus with his companion cavalry, positioned on the right, directly opposite the Persian left flank. Navigation began. It followed a pattern that would become Alexander's trademark. The phalanx engaged the Persian center, the Thessalians held the left against superior numbers, and Alexander led a hammer-blow charge on the right, cutting through the Persian flank like a sword through cloth. The companion cavalry crashed into the Persian line with devastating force. Alexander was at the point of the charge, visible in his brilliant armor, his white plume marking him as clearly as a banner, and he drove straight toward the center, straight toward Darius himself. This was the decisive moment, the point where the battle would be won or lost. The Persian king watched the Macedonian wedge driving toward him, watched this young warrior king cutting down anyone who stood in his way, and something broke inside him. Whether it was fear, prudence, or simply recognition that the battle was lost, Darius turned his chariot and fled the field. The impact of the king's flight was immediate and catastrophic. The Persian center, seeing their sovereign abandon them, began to dissolve. What had been an army became a mob, soldiers throwing down weapons and running for their lives. The disciplined formations shattered into chaos, and the Macedonians pursued with ruthless efficiency, cutting down the fleeing enemy. Only the Greek mercenaries held firm, retreating in good order, maintaining their formation even as the Persian army collapsed around them. They had no love for Persia, but they were professionals, and they covered the retreat as best they could before finally breaking contact and escaping into the mountains. The Persian camp fell into Macedonian hands, and with it came a treasure beyond imagining. Darius had brought his entire royal household on campaign, confident of victory, and now they were Alexander's prisoners. The queen mother Sisygambis, Darius's wife, Statera, his daughters, his wealth, his records, all fell to the conqueror. Alexander's treatment of the royal women would become one of the most famous episodes of his entire campaign. When he first entered the royal tent and saw the Persian princesses, he was struck by their beauty and dignity. The queen mother, seeing Alexander and his companion Hephaestion, bowed before Hephaestion, assuming the taller, more imposing man must be the king. When the mistake was pointed out, she was mortified, but Alexander laughed and said, "You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." From that moment, Sisygambis became devoted to Alexander, treating him like the son she had lost when Darius fled. The captive queen became his advocate, softening Persian resistance with her example, showing that Alexander could be generous in victory. He returned all the royal women to their quarters with assurances they would be treated with the respect due their station. He provided them with servants, with fine clothing, with every comfort. He promised that no harm would come to them, and he kept that promise. This behavior was so unusual for the time, so contrary to the expected treatment of prisoners of war, that it shocked both his own soldiers and the Persian nobility. Some said he was being weak, that he should take what he wanted by right of conquest. Others understood it as brilliant strategy, a demonstration that Alexander sought not merely to conquer Persia, but to rule it, and rulers needed subjects who would accept their authority willingly. Darius, fleeing eastward, sent messengers to Alexander offering terms. He would pay an enormous ransom for his family. He would cede all territory west of the Euphrates River. He would offer his daughter in marriage to cement a permanent peace between Macedonia and Persia. It was a generous offer, one that would make Alexander the most powerful king in the Western world. Crimson, Hemenian, ever cautious, advised acceptance. "I would take this offer if I were Alexander," he said. Alexander replied coldly, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." He sent the messenger back with his own terms: unconditional surrender. Darius must acknowledge Alexander as the rightful great king, must submit completely, must accept that the Persian Empire now belonged to its conqueror. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. Only total victory would satisfy Alexander. Darius refused and retreated deeper into his empire, gathering a new army, preparing for another confrontation. But the psychological damage was immense. The great king had fled the field at Issus. He had abandoned his family. He had offered terms and been rejected. The aura of Persian invincibility had been shattered. Meanwhile, Alexander turned south rather than pursuing Darius immediately. This surprised many observers, but it demonstrated his strategic sophistication. Before he could march into the Persian heartland, he needed to secure his western flank and eliminate the threat of the Persian navy. So he marched down the Mediterranean coast, capturing every port, systematically destroying Persian sea power by taking away every harbor where the fleet could resupply or find safe anchorage. City after city fell. Damascus surrendered with its treasure intact. The island fortress of Tyre resisted for 7 months before being taken by assault in one of the most remarkable sieges in military history. Gaza held out for 2 months before its walls were breached and its population massacred as a warning to others. And then Egypt opened its arms to him. The Egyptians had been ruled by Persia for generations and hated their overlords. When Alexander appeared at their borders, they welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian satrap surrendered without a fight, and Alexander entered Memphis in triumph. Egypt transformed Alexander in ways that even he might not have fully understood at the time. The ancient civilization, with its millennia of history, its enormous monuments, its priest-kings who claimed divine ancestry, made a profound impression on the young Macedonian. The Egyptians accepted him as pharaoh, and he began to see himself differently, not merely as a Macedonian king or a Greek general, but as a world ruler chosen by the gods. In the spring of 331 BC, he made a journey that would define the rest of his life and his legacy. He traveled across the desert to the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of Zeus Ammon had spoken for centuries, where pharaohs had come seeking divine confirmation of their right to rule. The journey was arduous and dangerous, through desert sands where men could lose their way and die of thirst. But Alexander pressed on, driven by a need to know, to understand, to have his destiny confirmed by powers greater than mortal kings. What passed between Alexander and the oracle in that sacred sanctuary, no one knows with certainty. The priests spoke only to the king, in private, and Alexander never fully revealed what was said. But when he emerged from the temple, something had changed. His manner was different, his confidence even more absolute, his conviction of divine favor unshakable. Some ancient sources claim the oracle greeted him as son of Zeus, confirming what Olympius had told him since childhood. Others say the oracle called him son of Ammon, the Egyptian god whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. Whatever the words, the effect was profound. Alexander began to believe he was not merely blessed by the gods, but descended from them, that divine blood flowed in his veins, that he was destined not just for greatness, but for apotheosis, for elevation to divine status himself. This transformation worried some of his Macedonian officers, who saw their king drifting away from his roots, adopting foreign customs and ideas, becoming something other than the Macedonian prince they had followed across the Hellespont. But Alexander was beyond their counsel now. He had looked into the face of destiny at Siwa, and what he saw there had changed him irrevocably. He returned to the Mediterranean coast and founded a city that would bear his name and become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, Alexandria. He chose the site personally, marked out the walls, designated the major streets and buildings. The city would blend Greek and Egyptian culture, would house the greatest library ever built, would become a center of learning and commerce that would flourish for 1,000 years. But Alexandria was for the future. In the present, Darius was gathering another massive army, larger than the force at Issus, and he had chosen his battleground carefully this time. On the plains of Gaugamela, in northern Mesopotamia, where Persian cavalry would have room to maneuver, where numbers would matter, the great king would make his final stand. Alexander had conquered the western third of the Persian Empire. He had captured Egypt, secured the coast, built a reputation that made kings tremble and cities surrender without a fight. But the decisive battle still lay ahead, the confrontation that would determine whether he would rule an empire or die trying to claim one. The oracle at Siwa had called him son of a god. Now he had to prove he was worthy of that title, had to demonstrate that divine favor translated into mortal victory. The greatest test of his military genius awaited him on the plains of Mesopotamia, and the fate of the ancient world hung in the balance. Everything he had accomplished so far was merely prologue. The real story was about to begin. The breaking of an empire. Discharged, Thirst, 331 BC. The plains of Gaugamela. Dawn broke over a landscape transformed into a vision of terrifying power. As far as Alexander could see, the Persian army spread across the horizon like an ocean of armed humanity. Darius had spent a year gathering this host, calling in forces from every corner of his empire, and the result was the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 200,000 men, though ancient sources claim far more. Cavalry from Bactria and Scythia, infantry from Syria and Mesopotamia, war elephants from India, scythed chariots with blades extending from their wheels designed to tear through enemy formations. Darius had even leveled and smoothed the plain itself, creating perfect terrain for his chariots and cavalry to operate. This was to be the battle that ended the Greek invasion, that restored Persian honor, that reminded the world that empires 2 centuries old did not fall to upstart kings barely out of adolescence. The great king sat in the center of his line, in a chariot plated with silver and gold, surrounded by his immortals, the elite guard that had never known defeat. Consul Alexander had perhaps 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. He was outnumbered by margins that should have been insurmountable, facing an enemy who held every advantage of position and terrain. Any rational commander would have sought to negotiate, to retreat, to find some way to avoid this confrontation. Alexander spent the night before the battle sleeping so soundly that his officers had to wake him when it was time to prepare. He rose refreshed, ate breakfast calmly, dressed in his finest armor, mounted Bucephalus, and rode out to inspect his troops as if he were attending a festival rather than preparing for a battle that would decide the fate of the known world. Unauthorized his forces with the tactical brilliance that was becoming his hallmark. The phalanx held the center, but with a crucial innovation, a second line of infantry behind them to prevent encirclement, because he knew Darius's strategy would be to envelop his smaller force. The Thessalian cavalry guarded the left wing under Parmenian's command, and Alexander positioned himself on the right with the companion cavalry, directly across from Darius's left flank. But this time, Alexander added a new element. He angled his entire army slightly to the right, away from the leveled ground that Darius had prepared, forcing the Persians to extend their line to maintain contact. This served multiple purposes. It negated the terrain advantage, it stretched the enemy formation thin, and it created gaps in the Persian line that Alexander could exploit. When the battle began, Darius launched his scythed chariots, 100 war machines of terror designed to shatter enemy formations through shock and horror. They thundered toward the Macedonian phalanx, wheels spinning blades of death. But Alexander had drilled his men for exactly this threat. The infantry opened lanes in their formation, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through, while javelin men and archers shot down the drivers. Quadratic, the chariots that survived the gauntlet ploughed into empty space, their momentum spent, their threat neutralized. It was a humiliating failure for one of Darius's most fearsome weapons, a demonstration that Alexander had an answer for everything the Persian king could deploy. The cavalry battle on the flanks raged for hours. The Thessalians on the left fought desperately against superior numbers, holding their ground but unable to advance. This was exactly what Alexander needed. Parmenion fixing Persian attention while the king prepared his decisive blow. On the right, Alexander engaged the enemy cavalry in a series of feints and probes, drawing them out, extending them, looking for the moment when the Persian line would crack. And then he saw it, the gap he had been waiting for, the inevitable result of Darius extending his forces to match the Macedonian rightward drift. Alexander formed his companion cavalry into a wedge, with himself at the point, and they charged. Not toward the enemy flank, but diagonally across the battlefield, driving straight for the gap, cutting through the Persian line like a spear through flesh. The phalanx followed, exploiting the breakthrough, turning the Persian left into chaos. Once again, Alexander drove for Darius himself, visible in his magnificent chariot, and once again, the psychological warfare proved decisive. The great king watched this Macedonian king charging directly toward him with unstoppable momentum, watched his line collapsing, watched death approaching on a black war horse, and he broke. For the second time in 2 years, Darius fled the field. He abandoned his army, abandoned his chariot when it became stuck, mounted a horse, and rode for his life. The Persian center dissolved into panic, soldiers throwing down weapons and fleeing in every direction, the army becoming a mob, the battle becoming a massacre. But Alexander could not pursue immediately. In the chaos of battle, a gap had opened in his own line, and Persian cavalry had broken through, creating havoc in his rear. For a few terrifying moments, the battle's outcome hung in the balance. Parmenion on the left wing sent urgent messages requesting aid. He broke off the futuristic decision. He wheeled his cavalry around to deal with the crisis. The resulting cavalry battle was brutal and desperate, but the companions finally prevailed, crushing the Persian breakthrough and securing victory. By the time Alexander could resume his pursuit of Darius, night had fallen, and the great king had vanished into the darkness. He would escape yet again, fleeing east toward the Iranian plateau, gathering what forces he could, hoping to make a final stand in the empire's heartland. But Darius was finished, and everyone knew it. He had fled the field twice, had left 2 armies to be destroyed, had abandoned his capital and his wealth. Whatever legitimacy he still claimed as great king was draining away with every mile he fled. Alexander did not immediately pursue him deeper into Persia. Instead, he turned south and began the process of claiming his prize. Babylon, the greatest city in Mesopotamia, opened its gates and welcomed him as a liberator. The priests of Marduk recognized him as the rightful king, and he entered the city in triumph, riding at the head of his army while crowds lined the streets and flowers rained down from the rooftops. After Babylon came Susa, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire, where the royal treasuries held wealth accumulated over 2 centuries. Alexander captured it without a fight and took possession of 40,000 talents of gold and silver, wealth so vast it took thousands of mules to transport it. With that single acquisition, he became the richest man in the world, able to pay his army, fund his campaigns, and build his empire without constraint. Patriotism came Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the sacred heart of Persian power, where the great kings had been crowned for generations. Alexander took the city in early 330 BC, and what happened next would stain his reputation forever. Transporting by design or drunken accident, Persepolis burned. Some sources claim Alexander ordered it destroyed as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier, a symbolic demonstration that the wars between Greece and Persia had finally ended in Greek victory. Other sources suggest it was an accident during a drunken revel, that Alexander and his companions, inflamed by wine and victory, set fire to the royal palace in a moment of excess. Whatever the truth, the result was catastrophic. The magnificent palace complex, built over generations by artisans and architects from across the empire, was reduced to ash. The columns cracked from heat, the carvings were obliterated, the libraries burned, and with them went irreplaceable records and works of art. The destruction of Persepolis was a turning point, the moment when Alexander's campaign transformed from liberation to conquest, from freeing Persian subjects to claiming the empire for himself. Many Persians who might have accepted him as king after Darius's failures now saw him as simply another foreign invader. The burning of their sacred capital was an unforgivable insult, and resistance hardened across the eastern provinces. But Alexander was past the point where such concerns could deter him. He marched east in pursuit of Darius, determined to capture the fugitive king and legitimize his claim to the empire. For nearly a year, he chased the great king across Persia and into the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, an exhausting campaign through difficult terrain against an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Finally, in the summer of 330 BC, received word that Darius was near. He pushed his forces to the limit, riding day and night with a select group of cavalry to catch the Persian king before he could escape again. But when Alexander finally reached Darius, he found only a dying man lying in a cart, mortally wounded. Bessus, one of Darius's own generals and the satrap of Bactria, had betrayed him. Seeing the great king as a liability, as an obstacle to organizing effective resistance, Bessus and his co-conspirators had stabbed Darius and left him to die. They hoped that by removing the failed king, they could rally Persian forces under new leadership and continue the war. Alexander found Darius in his final moments, if ancient sources can be believed. Some accounts say the great king asked Alexander to avenge him, to punish the traitors who had murdered their rightful sovereign. Whether this scene actually occurred or was invented later for dramatic effect, we cannot know. But it fit the narrative Alexander was constructing, the idea that he was not a foreign conqueror, but the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne, punishing traitors and bringing justice. Darius died, and Alexander gave him a royal funeral with full honors, burying him in the tombs of his ancestors at Persepolis. He declared himself the great king's legitimate heir, the avenger of regicide, the rightful ruler of the Persian Empire. And then he turned his attention to hunting down Bessus and the other conspirators. The death of Darius should have ended the war, but it did not. Bessus declared himself great king and continued to resist. Other Persian nobles also refused to accept Alexander's claim to the throne. The easy conquests of the Western Empire gave way to years of brutal guerrilla warfare in the mountains and deserts of the east. Alexander pushed into Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, regions that had been only nominally under Persian control and now resisted Macedonian rule with fierce determination. The fighting was savage and unforgiving, cities destroyed, populations massacred, valleys burned to deny shelter to insurgents. It was during this period that Alexander's character darkened. The young king who had shown mercy to Persian princesses now showed increasing cruelty to his enemies. He founded military colonies throughout the region, garrisoned with Macedonian and Greek veterans who were essentially told to hold the frontier or die trying. Many of these settlements were attacked and wiped out by local forces. Alexander himself was wounded multiple times during this phase of the campaign. An arrow through the leg in one battle, a stone that fractured his skull in another, a sword cut that left a permanent scar. He seemed to court death, always at the front of any assault, always the first through a breach in enemy walls, and his officers began to wonder if he was trying to prove something or simply no longer cared whether he lived or died. He captured Bessus after a year of pursuit and had him tortured and executed in the Persian manner, sending a message that no one betrayed a king and lived. But the guerrilla war continued, and Alexander grew increasingly frustrated and volatile. The campaign was taking longer than he had anticipated, costing more in blood and treasure, and victory remained elusive. It was in this period that his relationship with his Macedonian officers began to fracture. They had followed him from Greece to Persia, had endured years of campaigning, had won battles that should have ended the war, and now they found themselves fighting an endless insurgency in mountains and deserts far from home. Some began to question whether Alexander had gone too far, whether his ambition had become obsession, whether he still served Macedonia's interests or only his own dreams of godhood. The tensions would explode into violence in ways that no one could have predicted, testing loyalties that had seemed unbreakable and revealing the dark side of Alexander's character. The hero of Gaugamela was becoming something else, something his companions did not recognize and did not know how to control. The Persian Empire had fallen, but Alexander was not finished. His dreams stretched beyond Persia, toward lands even more distant, toward the edge of the known world and beyond. The breaking of one empire was simply the prelude to building another, and that process would test him in ways that military genius could not overcome. Into the unknown. Winter 328 BC. Samarkand, in the heart of Central Asia. The feast should have been a celebration. Alexander had just captured another stronghold in the endless campaign to pacify Sogdiana, and he gathered his senior officers to rest, drink, and remember easier days. Wine flowed freely, stronger than the wine the Greeks usually drank, and inhibitions dissolved as the cups emptied and refilled. Alexander had been drinking heavily for hours when the conversation turned to comparing his achievements with those of his father Philip. It was a dangerous topic, one that always stirred complex emotions in Alexander. Some of the older officers, veterans who had served Philip before his assassination, began praising the former king's accomplishments, suggesting perhaps that Alexander had built his empire on foundations his father had laid. Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus River 7 years earlier, was drunk and bitter. He had watched Alexander adopt Persian customs, take Persian wives, elevate former enemies to positions of power while Macedonian veterans were passed over. The gratitude he expected for his years of service and his life-saving intervention had not materialized in the way he had hoped. Emboldened by wine and resentment, Clytus spoke words that should have remained unspoken. He praised Philip excessively, suggesting that Alexander's victories were less impressive than his father's, that Alexander had simply finished what Philip started. He reminded everyone that it was his intervention that had saved Alexander at the Granicus, implying that the king owed his life, and therefore his empire, to a Macedonian officer who was now being marginalized. The other officers tried to quiet him, sensing the danger, but Clytus was too far gone, his years of suppressed frustration boiling over. He quoted a line from Euripides, pointedly changing it to suggest that Alexander took credit for victories his soldiers won, that the king's glory was built on the bones of men who died while he claimed divine ancestry. Alexander, also drunk, rose from his couch, trembling with rage. The room fell silent. Friends tried to intervene, to separate king and officer, to defuse the situation before it spiraled into tragedy. They managed to pull Clytus away and hustle him out of the feast hall. But Clytus broke free from the men restraining him and burst back into the room, still shouting insults, drunk and reckless and beyond reason. Alexander, in a moment of blind fury, grabbed a spear from one of the guards and drove it through Clytus's chest. The man who had saved his life at the Granicus fell dead at his feet, blood spreading across the floor, the room frozen in horror. From his rage, Alexander seemed to wake from he had done, at his friend and savior lying dead by his own hand, and the reality crashed over him like a wave. He fell to his knees, tried to turn the spear on himself, wailing in anguish. His guards grabbed him, prevented him from harming himself, but could not stop the emotional collapse that followed. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, refusing food, refusing company, weeping and calling out Clytus's name. He seemed genuinely broken by what he had done, tortured by guilt and horror. The army did not know what to do. Some worried he might never recover, that the king who had seemed superhuman had finally encountered something he could not overcome, his own capacity for violence against those he loved. The priests were called to declare that the killing had been justified, that Clytus had committed sacrilege by insulting the king, that divine wrath had acted through Alexander's hand. The philosophers argued that kings by their nature operated beyond ordinary morality, that their actions could not be judged by conventional standards. These rationalizations were politically necessary, ways to maintain order and prevent the incident from fracturing the army. Alexander eventually emerged from his tent, haggard and haunted, but resumed command. However, something had changed. He never forgot Clytus's death, never forgave himself for that moment of uncontrolled rage. It was a crack in his carefully constructed image of divine invincibility, a demonstration that he was not beyond the reach of human weakness and human consequences. The campaign in Central Asia continued, brutal and exhausting. Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a local chieftain, partly for love and partly to cement alliances with the native population. She was reportedly one of the most beautiful women in Asia, and Alexander was genuinely attracted to her. But the marriage also served political purposes, demonstrating that he was willing to blend Greek and Persian bloodlines, that his empire would be multicultural rather than simply Greek rule over conquered territories. This policy of cultural fusion, what historians call his policy of fusion, became increasingly pronounced as the campaigns wore on. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian noblewomen. He trained 30,000 Persian youths in Macedonian warfare and admitted them to his army. He adopted elements of Persian court ritual, including the practice of proskynesis, where subjects bowed or prostrated themselves before the king. This last adoption caused enormous to Greeks and Macedonians. Prostration was an act of worship reserved for the gods. To Persians, it was simply a sign of respect for a superior. But when Alexander tried to introduce the practice at his court, requiring even Greek and Macedonian officers to prostrate themselves, there was fierce resistance. Callisthenes, a historian and nephew of Aristotle who was chronicling the campaign, publicly refused to perform proskynesis, arguing that it violated Greek values and reduced free men to the status of slaves. Others followed his lead, and Alexander, sensing the depth of opposition, quietly dropped the requirement for Greeks and Macedonians, though he continued to expect it from his Persian subjects. But Callisthenes had made a powerful enemy, and when a conspiracy among the royal pages was uncovered, he was implicated and executed. The evidence of his involvement was thin at best, and many believed Alexander used the conspiracy as an excuse to remove a man who had challenged him publicly. The death of Callisthenes further alienated the peripatetic school of philosophy that had connections to Aristotle, turning some of Greece's intellectual elite against the king. By 327 BC, Alexander had pacified Central Asia through a combination of military force, strategic marriages, and the establishment of garrison cities. He had pushed the boundaries of his empire far beyond the old Persian territories, into regions that even Darius had controlled only nominally. But instead of returning west to consolidate his conquests, to organize his administration, to enjoy the fruits of a decade of warfare, Alexander looked further east. India. The land beyond the mountains, wealthy and mysterious, with kingdoms that Greek travelers had described, but no Greek army had ever conquered. Alexander decided to invade, to push toward the edge of the known world, to see what lay beyond the maps. His officers were exhausted. They had been campaigning for 7 years without a break, fighting in deserts and mountains, losing friends to battle and disease, and the sheer attrition of endless warfare. They had conquered the Persian Empire, had achieved more than anyone had dreamed possible, and now they were being asked to march into yet another unknown region, to face yet another enemy, to risk everything they had won for the sake of Alexander's insatiable ambition. But they were soldiers, and Alexander was their king, and they had followed him this far. So they gathered their strength, checked their equipment, said goodbye to their wives and children in the garrison cities, and prepared for one more campaign. They told themselves it would be the last, that India would satisfy Alexander's hunger for conquest, that after this they could finally go home. They were wrong. Alexander's ambition had no natural limit, no point at which he would say, enough. He was driven by something deeper than rational calculation, by a need to prove himself worthy of the divine ancestry he claimed, to match the achievements of mythological heroes, to reach the very edge of the world and plant his banner there. The Indian campaign would be his greatest military achievement and his ultimate failure. It would reveal both his genius and his limitations, would show what happened when an army pushed beyond all reasonable endurance, would demonstrate that even Alexander could not force men to follow him beyond a certain point. The edge of the world awaited, and with it would come the realization that some boundaries cannot be crossed by mortal will alone, no matter how divine one claims to be, no matter how many battles one has won. The edge of the world. Chimp Summer 327 BC. The foothills of the Hindu Kush, the army that descended from the mountains into India, was different from the force that had crossed the Hellespont 9 years earlier. The original Macedonian and Greek troops had been depleted by years of battle, replaced and supplemented by soldiers from every corner of the expanding empire. Persians, Bactrians, Sogdians, warriors who had once fought against Alexander now fought for him, integrated into his force through the same tactical innovations that had made Philip's army unstoppable. The advance into the subcontinent followed 2 routes. The main force, under Alexander's direct command, took the northern path through the Khyber Pass, while a smaller contingent moved through more direct but easier terrain. They reunited in the spring of 326 BC, and Alexander immediately faced his first major challenge. Porus controlled the region between the Hydaspes and Assassines rivers, essentially modern Punjab. He was a formidable ruler, commanding a substantial army and respected throughout the region for his courage and military skill. When Alexander sent envoys demanding submission, Porus sent back a message that he would meet Alexander at the borders of his kingdom, but with weapons in hand rather than tribute. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in May 326 BC during the monsoon season, would become one of Alexander's most celebrated victories and one of his most challenging battles. The Hydaspes River was deep and fast-moving, swollen with seasonal rains, and Porus positioned his army on the far bank with excellent defensive advantages. Most significantly, Porus deployed war elephants, massive animals that the Macedonian horses had never encountered. These elephants, carrying towers on their backs filled with archers and javelin throwers, were terrifying weapons of psychological and physical warfare. The horses would panic at their sight and smell, breaking formations and creating chaos. Alexander faced a seemingly impossible tactical problem. He needed to cross a monsoon-swollen river under the observation of an enemy army equipped with weapons specifically designed to neutralize his cavalry advantage. Any direct assault would be suicide. So he employed deception on a grand scale. For weeks, he moved his forces up and down the river, creating the appearance of preparing to cross at multiple points. Porus was forced to mirror these movements, marching his army back and forth, trying to be ready wherever Alexander might attack. The Macedonians created constant noise and activity, preventing the enemy from resting, wearing down their vigilance. Confiscated, then, on a night of torrential rain and absolute darkness, Alexander made his move. He left a substantial force at his main camp, with orders to create the impression that the entire army was still there. Meanwhile, he led a select force of cavalry and infantry 17 miles upriver to a wooded island that concealed his movements. The crossing was harrowing. The river was in full flood, the current tremendous, the visibility nearly zero. Boats were swamped, horses struggled in the raging water, men were swept away. But enough of the force made it across to establish a beachhead on the far bank. When Porus learned of the crossing, he initially thought it might be a feint, a small force designed to draw him away from the main threat. By the time he realized that Alexander himself had crossed with a substantial force, precious hours had been lost. He left a smaller force to watch the Macedonian camp and marched with his main army to confront Alexander. The two forces met on a plain that gave Porus room to deploy his elephants and chariots. His army may have numbered over 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and somewhere between 80 and 200 elephants, depending on which ancient source you trust. Alexander had brought perhaps 15,000 men across the river, and more were crossing behind him, but he was still significantly outnumbered. The battle began with Alexander probing the enemy line, testing how the elephants would respond, looking for weaknesses in Porus's formation. He had ordered his archers and javelin men to target the elephants specifically, aiming for the mahouts who controlled them and for the animals themselves, trying to panic them and turn them into liabilities rather than assets. The strategy worked, but only partially. Some elephants panicked and ran wild, trampling friend and foe alike. But others held firm, and the battle became a grinding, desperate affair, unlike the swift, decisive victories that had characterized Alexander's earlier campaigns. The fighting lasted hours, both sides suffering heavy casualties, the outcome genuinely in doubt. Alexander eventually prevailed through tactical flexibility and the superior training of his troops. His phalanx held against the elephants, taking losses but maintaining formation. His cavalry found gaps in the enemy line and exploited them ruthlessly. And gradually, inevitably, the Indian army began to collapse. Porus himself fought with extraordinary courage, mounted on the largest elephant in his army, wounded but refusing to flee or surrender. Only when the battle was clearly lost and his army in full retreat did he finally halt and dismount, bleeding from multiple wounds, ready to die rather than submit. Swallowing, Alexander rode up on Bucephalus and asked how Porus wished to be treated. The Indian king's response became legendary. "Treat me as a king would treat another king," he said, standing tall despite his wounds, meeting Alexander's gaze without flinching. Alexander was impressed, perhaps even moved, by this display of dignity and courage. Instead of humiliating his defeated enemy or parading him as a captive, he not only allowed Porus to keep his kingdom, but expanded its borders, making him a satrap and ally. This treatment of a brave enemy was classic. Alexander, generous in victory to those who showed courage, savage to those who showed weakness or betrayal. But the victory came at a cost. The Battle of the Hydaspes was possibly the bloodiest engagement of Alexander's career. Thousands of Macedonians died or were wounded, and many of the casualties were veterans who had followed Alexander from the beginning. The army that had seemed invincible was bleeding, literally and figuratively. And then came another blow. Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved horse, the animal that had carried him through every major battle since he was a boy, died shortly after the engagement. Whether from wounds sustained in battle, exhaustion, or simply old age, the great black stallion finally fell. Alexander was inconsolable. He founded a city, Bucephala, on the site where the horse died, an honor given to an animal that had been his constant companion for 20 years. The loss of Bucephalus seemed symbolic, a sign that even Alexander's closest connections to his youth and his homeland were being severed. He was far from Macedonia now, in more than just geographical terms. He was becoming something other than a Macedonian king, transforming into an Eastern potentate, ruling over peoples who spoke languages he did not know, following customs he had not been raised with. After Hydaspes, Alexander pushed further east, conquering the small kingdoms and tribal confederations that stood in his path. The monsoon rains continued, making every march a struggle through mud and misery. Supplies ran low, disease spread through the camps, and morale began to crack. Finally, in July 326 BC, the army reached the Hyphasis River, known today as the Beas. Beyond lay the Ganges Plain and the powerful Nanda Empire, with armies and elephant corps that dwarfed anything Alexander had yet faced. Greek sources suggest the Nanda army might have numbered 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and thousands of war elephants. Alexander assembled his troops and announced his intention to continue eastward, to conquer the Ganges Valley, to reach the end of India and the ocean that Greek geographers believed surrounded the world. He painted a vision of total victory, of an empire stretching from Greece to the ends of the earth, of glory that would echo through all eternity. His soldiers listened in sullen silence. When he finished speaking and asked who would follow him, no cheers erupted, no enthusiasm showed. The army that had followed him for 11 years, that had conquered from the Mediterranean to the Indus, that had never refused him anything, now stood mute and resistant. Crimson, one of his most trusted generals, who finally found the courage to speak. He praised Alexander's achievements and courage, but pointed out harsh realities. The men had been campaigning for 11 years without proper rest. Many had not seen their families in over a decade. They were thousands of miles from home, in a land of endless cern, monsoons and hostile populations, and they were tired. The equipment was worn out, he said. The horses were exhausted. Veterans who had survived multiple battles were dying from disease and exposure in the Indian climate. The prospect of facing another massive army, another series of campaigns in yet another unknown land, was more than they could bear. Other officers echoed Coenus's words. For the first time in his career, Alexander faced something he could not overcome with tactical brilliance or personal courage. The simple exhaustion and homesickness of men who had given everything and had nothing left to give. Alexander's response was telling. He withdrew to his tent and remained there for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, sulking like a child denied a treat. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why his men would not follow him, unable to accept that there were limits to what even the most devoted soldiers could endure. Peaceful, when he finally emerged, he announced that the omens were unfavorable, that the gods themselves counseled turning back. It was a face-saving device, allowing him to reverse course without admitting that his own men had refused him. But everyone understood what had really happened. For the first time, Alexander had been forced to compromise, to accept limits, to acknowledge that his will was not absolute. He ordered the construction of 12 massive altars to the gods, each 50 cubits high, monuments to mark the easternmost point of his conquests. Then he turned the army around and began the long journey back westward. Enlargence would be as challenging as any battle, a test of endurance through harsh terrain and hostile territories. And it would end in Babylon, where fate had one final surprise, waiting for the king who thought he was a god. The edge of the world had been reached, and it turned out to be not a boundary between earth and ocean, but a boundary between what was possible and what was not, between human endurance and superhuman ambition. Alexander had finally encountered something he could not conquer, and that something was the limits of mortal will. The long road home. Downstream. The march back from India was not a triumphant procession, but a grinding ordeal that tested the army more severely than many battles had done. Commanded Alexander divided his forces for the return journey. One contingent, under Craterus, would take the wounded and the elephants back through the more established routes to the north. The fleet, under Admiral Nearchus, would sail down the Indus River, explore the coastline, and eventually meet the main army at the Persian Gulf. And Alexander himself would lead the bulk of the army south through India and then west across the Gedrosian desert. The march through India became a series of bloody engagements with tribes who saw the retreating army as weakened prey. The Malians, a warrior culture renowned for their ferocity, refused to submit and fought with desperate courage. At one Malian stronghold, Alexander grew impatient with the slow progress of the siege and personally led a small group over the walls while his main force was still positioning ladders. He found himself and a handful of companions isolated on the battlements, surrounded by defenders, while his army frantically tried to reach him. An arrow struck Alexander in the chest, penetrating his lung. He collapsed, blood frothing from his mouth, and for a terrifying moment it seemed the campaign would end there, in an obscure Indian fortress. His bodyguards formed a protective barrier around their fallen king, while the Macedonian army, seeing Alexander down and fearing him dead, went berserk with rage and panic. They poured over the walls in their fury and massacred the fortresses meanwhile. The surgeons worked desperately on Alexander, removing the arrowhead and trying to stop the bleeding. The wound was severe, perhaps the closest Alexander ever came to death in combat, and it took weeks for him to recover enough to travel. When he finally appeared before his troops, carried on a litter because he could not yet ride, the army wept with relief. They had convinced themselves he was dead, that their king and talisman had been taken from them in a pointless skirmish far from home. His survival seemed miraculous, further proof of his divine protection. But Alexander was not indestructible, and his officers had seen him lying in his own blood, gasping for breath, mortal and vulnerable. Another crack had appeared in the myth of his invincibility. By the autumn of 325 BC, the army had reached the coast and prepared for the most harrowing part of the journey home. Alexander chose to march through the Gedrosian desert, a wasteland in southern Iran, reportedly because he wanted to match the feat of the legendary Persian queen Semiramis and the conqueror Cyrus the Great, both of whom had attempted the crossing and barely survived. It was a decision that would cost thousands of lives. The Gedrosian desert in summer is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Temperatures soar above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Water sources are few and unreliable. Sandstorms can bury entire columns of men. There are no landmarks to navigate by, no shelter from the sun, no relief from the heat. Clang the army marched at night when possible, trying to avoid the worst of the heat, but it was not enough. Water ran out within days. The pack animals began to die, and with them went the supplies they carried. Men began to fall, succumbing to heat exhaustion and dehydration. The columns stretched for miles, the weakest falling farther and farther behind until they simply collapsed and were left to die. Ancient sources describe scenes of horror. Soldiers found water in dry riverbeds and drank until they became sick, then drank more. Flash floods swept away entire groups of men and equipment. The sand became a grave for thousands, their bodies marked only by whatever gear they carried, soon to be buried by the shifting dunes. Communicator himself nearly died when a flash flood swept through the camp one night. He shared the hardships of his men, refusing water when there was not enough for everyone, walking rather than riding when horses became too valuable to waste. But his leadership could not overcome the fundamental reality that he had led his army into a death trap. When the survivors finally staggered out of the desert 2 months later, perhaps a quarter of the force that had entered was dead. It was a catastrophic loss, worse than any battle, a needless sacrifice to Alexander's pride and ambition. The officers were furious, the soldiers traumatized, and the campaign's triumphant character was completely destroyed. The army reunited with Craterus's column and with Nearchus's fleet, which had completed its own harrowing voyage, and together they marched to the Persian capital of Susa. It was January 324 BC, and they had been gone from the Western Empire for nearly 4 years. Confisca, Alexander attempted to implement his vision of cultural fusion on a grand scale. He arranged a mass wedding ceremony where 90 of his senior officers married Persian noblewomen, and he himself took 2 additional wives to join Roxana, both daughters of Persian royalty. 10,000 of his soldiers also married Asian women in a ceremony designed to demonstrate that the new empire would be multicultural, a blending of Greek and Persian bloodlines and traditions. But many of the Macedonian officers resented this forced fusion. They had conquered the Persian Empire, and they saw themselves as victors, not as partners in some experiment of cultural harmony. They wanted to enjoy the fruits of conquest, to rule over the defeated, not to marry into their families and adopt their customs. Tensions that had been building for years came to a head at Opis when Alexander announced his intention to discharge the oldest and most exhausted veterans, sending them home to Macedonia with generous pensions. Instead of gratitude, he received mutiny. The soldiers interpreted the discharge as rejection, as a sign that Alexander no longer valued his Macedonian veterans now that he had his Persian troops. Alexander responded with fury. He had 32 of the ringleaders executed immediately, then told the entire army that they were all dismissed, that he would rule his empire with Persian soldiers alone. For 3 days, he remained in his tent, conducting all business with Persian officers, ignoring the Macedonians completely. Finally, the army broke. The soldiers surrounded his tent, weeping and begging for forgiveness, saying they would rather die than be sent away in disgrace. Alexander emerged and accepted their apologies, and there was a great feast of reconciliation. But the damage had been done. The relationship between Alexander and his army had been tested to its breaking point. In the aftermath of the mutiny, Alexander's closest friend and lover, Hephaestion, died suddenly in Ecbatana. The cause is uncertain, possibly typhoid or another disease, possibly alcohol poisoning during a feast. Alexander had known Hephaestion since childhood, had grown up with him at Mieza under Aristotle's tutelage, had shared every triumph and hardship since crossing the Hellespont. The death destroyed him. For days he would not eat or drink, lying on Hephaestion's body, refusing to be separated from his dead companion. When he finally allowed the body to be taken, he ordered a funeral that rivaled those of the ancient heroes. The physician who had failed to cure Hephaestion was crucified. A temple was raised. Games and sacrifices were held on an unprecedented scale. Alexander declared that Hephaestion would be worshipped as a divine hero, petitioned the oracle at Siwa for confirmation of this status, and began planning a monument in Babylon that would dwarf the pyramids of Egypt. The cost of the funeral and associated honors was astronomical, draining the royal treasury and shocking even those accustomed to Alexander's extravagance. Some historians suggest that Alexander never truly recovered from this loss, that Hephaestion's death removed the last restraint on his ambitions and his excesses. He became more isolated, more volatile, more convinced of his own divinity, and less interested in the counsel of those around him. He began planning new campaigns, age, then perhaps the Western Mediterranean. The empire would continue to expand until it covered the entire known world and whatever lay beyond. There would never be enough conquest to satisfy him, never a point where he would say, "This is sufficient." But the gods, or fate, or simple biology, had other plans. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon and began preparing for the Arabian campaign. He was 32 years old, had conquered more territory than any man in history, had built an empire that stretched from Greece to India, had become a living legend. And he was about to die in the most mysterious and controversial manner possible, leaving behind a legacy that would reshape the ancient world and echo through the millennia. The death of a god. Mendment, June 323 BC, Babylon. The month had been full of omens, though Alexander ignored most of them. The Chaldean priests had warned him not to enter Babylon from the west, saying their god Bel foretold disaster. Alexander initially turned away, then decided such superstition was beneath him and entered the city anyway. Ravens were seen fighting and falling dead at his feet, behavior so unusual that even the most skeptical officers found it disturbing. Soothsayers appeared with predictions of doom, and one declared himself king in Alexander's place in some obscure Babylonian ritual designed to divert divine wrath. Alexander dismissed it all. He was busy planning the Arabian campaign, organizing logistics, drilling troops, building a fleet. At 32, he stood at the height of his power, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, and he had no intention of slowing down. On the evening of May 29th, he attended a banquet hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa. The wine flowed freely, the conversation was animated, and Alexander drank heavily. He had always been able to hold his wine, and the evening seemed unremarkable, just another feast in a life full of them. The next day he felt unwell, but attributed it to the previous night's excesses. He attended to administrative duties, met with his officers to discuss the Arabian campaign, and in the evening attended another drinking party. The Macedonians were heavy drinkers by Greek standards, and Alexander had spent his entire adult life in an environment where alcohol consumption was both recreational and ritualistic. By June 2nd, he was clearly sick. He developed a fever that would not break, began experiencing severe pain in his back and abdomen, and found it difficult to eat or drink. The symptoms grew worse each day. The fever spiked higher. The pain intensified until he could barely move. His physicians tried every treatment they knew, but nothing helped. Ancient medical descriptions of his final illness are detailed enough that modern doctors have attempted retroactive diagnoses. The symptoms suggest several possibilities. Typhoid fever, common in ancient Babylon, fits many of the indicators. Malaria is another strong candidate. Some epidemiologists have proposed West Nile virus, noting the strange behavior of ravens before he fell ill and the fact that such viruses can cause encephalitis with Alexander's symptoms. More dramatic theories suggest poisoning. Ancient rumors pointed to Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedonia, who might have feared being recalled and executed. Antipater's son, Cassander, was in Babylon serving as royal cupbearer, with access to Alexander's drinks. Some sources claim the poison was so potent it could only be carried in the hoof of a horse, a detail that sounds more like legend than fact, but added to the conspiracy theories. Modern toxicologists have examined the articularly. Those derived from plants in the Helleborus family can produce symptoms similar to those Alexander experienced. But proving poisoning after 2,000 years is impossible, and the balance of evidence suggests natural causes were more likely. Whatever the actual cause, the illness progressed with terrifying speed. By June 7, Alexander could no longer speak. His officers filed past his bed, many weeping, believing they were seeing their king for the last time. According to the sources, Alexander could still recognize them and acknowledge their presence with his eyes, though he had lost the power of speech. On the evening of June 10, or the early morning of June 11, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was 3 months shy of his 33rd birthday. In just 13 years, he had conquered the largest empire in history, won every battle he fought, founded cities that would survive for millennia, and created a cultural fusion that would shape the development of Western civilization. His final words, if he managed to speak them at all, are disputed. One tradition holds that when asked who should succeed him, he replied, "To the strongest," virtually guaranteeing that his empire would be torn apart by civil war. Another claims he said, "To the best," which meant essentially the same thing. Most historians believe he was beyond speech by the time such questions were asked, and that these supposed final words were invented later to explain or justify what came after. What happened next became one of the ancient world's most famous mysteries. Alexander's body did not decompose. For 6 days, it lay in the Babylonian heat, and according to all accounts, showed no signs of decay. To the ancient Greeks and Macedonians, this was proof of divine nature, confirmation that Alexander had indeed been descended from the gods. Modern medicine offers a more prosaic explanation. Dr. Catherine Hall, a senior lecturer at the University of Otago in New Zealand, has proposed that Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder. This condition can cause progressive paralysis while leaving the victim conscious, and in severe cases, it can cause such profound paralysis that breathing becomes nearly imperceptible, making the person appear dead when they are still alive. If this diagnosis is correct, then Alexander may have been conscious but paralyzed in his final days, aware of everything happening around him but unable to move or speak. And the reason his body did not decay for 6 days was simple. He was not yet dead. He was in a coma, his breathing so shallow it could not be detected, and he was declared dead while still alive. It is a chilling possibility that the man who conquered the world spent his final hours trapped in his own paralyzed body, unable to communicate, watching helplessly as his officers began the process of dividing his empire. Whether this theory is correct, or whether he died of fever on June 10, we will never know with certainty. What we know is that his death triggered immediate chaos. He had no clear successor. His half-brother Philip Aridaeus was mentally incapacitated and unsuitable for rule. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and if she bore a son, that child could claim the throne, but an infant could not command the empire. His generals, the men who had fought beside him for years, immediately began maneuvering for position. Within a week of his death, the partition of Babylon divided the empire among his generals. Ptolemy claimed Egypt. Seleucus took the eastern territories. Antigonus held Phrygia. Craterus and Antipater controlled the European territories. Each swore loyalty to the royal family and promised to serve as guardians of Alexander's legacy. Within months, those promises meant nothing. The Wars of the Diadochi began, a 40-year period of nearly constant conflict as Alexander's generals fought each other for supremacy. Both Philip Aridaeus and Alexander IV, Roxana's son, were eventually murdered by rivals seeking to eliminate any claim to legitimate succession. By 281 BC, Alexander's empire had fractured into 3 major kingdoms and several smaller ones. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt until Cleopatra's death in 30 BC. The Seleucid Empire controlled much of the east until it was conquered by Rome and Parthia. The Antigonid dynasty held Macedonia until Rome absorbed it. None of Alexander's bloodline survived to inherit his throne. Unauthorized of Alexander's death has been debated for 2 millennia. Was it disease, poison, accident, or divine judgment? Was he conscious but paralyzed in his final days, or did he slip peacefully into unconsciousness? Did he have final words, and if so, did they seal his empire's fate? We will never know with certainty, and perhaps that is fitting. Alexander lived a life that blurred the boundaries between history and myth, between human achievement and divine intervention. That his death should also be shrouded in mystery, subject to endless speculation and competing theories, seems appropriate for a man who spent his entire life defying conventional limits. What we know for certain is that when Alexander died, the ancient world changed forever. The empire he built did not survive intact, but the forces he set in motion, the cultural fusion, the spread of Greek ideas across the East, the networks of trade and communication, the cities he founded, these endured and shaped the development of human civilization for centuries to come. Empire of the mind. The empire Alexander built with his sword fractured within a generation, torn apart by his generals in their struggle for supremacy. But the empire he built with his vision, the fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures, the spread of ideas across continents, the cities that became centers of learning and trade, this empire lasted for centuries and reshaped the ancient world. The Hellenistic period, stretching from Alexander's death in 323 BC to the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, was defined by his legacy. Greek became the lingua franca across his former territories, from Egypt to Afghanistan. Cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt most famously, but also dozens of others, became cosmopolitan centers where Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and other cultures mingled and evolved. Alexandria in Egypt exemplified this fusion. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, it grew into the greatest city of the Mediterranean world, home to the famous library that aimed to collect every book ever written, housing the Pharos lighthouse that was counted among the Seven Wonders, hosting scholars from across the known world. In Alexandria, Greek philosophers debated with Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars translated their scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, and scientists made discoveries that would not be matched for centuries. Euclid systematized geometry there, creating a textbook that remained standard for 2,000 years. Archimedes studied there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of Earth with remarkable accuracy. The city became synonymous with learning, with the pursuit of knowledge across cultural boundaries, with the idea that human understanding could transcend tribal loyalties and national identities. This was Alexander's true legacy, this cross-pollination of ideas and cultures. Greek art influenced Buddhist sculpture in Afghanistan, creating the distinctive Greco-Buddhist style. Greek philosophy spread east, influencing Indian thought. Eastern religious ideas flowed west, transforming Greek spirituality. The mystery religions that would compete with early Christianity had roots in this cultural fusion that Alexander's conquests initiated. Photographic empire in the East maintained Greek cities and culture across Persia and Mesopotamia for centuries. Though eventually conquered by the Parthians and then Rome, these cities remained centers of Hellenistic culture, preserving Greek learning and transmitting it to later civilizations. When Islamic scholars rediscovered Greek philosophy and science during the medieval period, they found it in these eastern outposts of Alexander's cultural empire. The military tactics Philip and Alexander developed influenced warfare for generations. The Roman legion evolved partly in response to the Macedonian phalanx, adopting some innovations while creating their own solutions to the challenges of maintaining discipline and flexibility in large formations. Every military commander studied Alexander's campaigns, trying to understand the principles that had led to his unprecedented success. Alexander's approach to conquest, absorbing rather than destroying cultures, adopting useful customs from defeated enemies, treating brave opponents with respect, set a template for empire building that influenced later conquerors. When Rome built its empire, it followed a similar pattern, spreading a common culture while tolerating local customs, creating infrastructure that outlasted political control. The cities he founded became nodes in a trade network that spanned from the Mediterranean to India. The Silk Road, which would later connect China to Europe, followed routes that Alexander's armies had pioneered. The merchant ships that crossed the Indian Ocean used ports he had established. The cultural and economic exchange that defined the ancient world was built on foundations he had laid. Perhaps most significantly, Alexander's campaigns exposed the Greek world to the enormous diversity of human culture and achievement. The Greeks had considered themselves superior to all others, had dismissed non-Greeks as barbarians lacking true civilization. But Alexander and those who traveled with him discovered advanced civilizations in Persia, Egypt, India, cultures with their own philosophical traditions, their own scientific achievements, their own artistic triumphs. This exposure forced a re-evaluation, encouraged a more cosmopolitan worldview, and led to the distinctive character of Hellenistic culture, Greek in language and many customs, but enriched and transformed by constant contact with other traditions. This openness to outside influences, this willingness to learn from other cultures, became one of the defining features of Western civilization. When Rome conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, they absorbed their culture along with their territory. Greek became the language of educated Romans. Greek philosophy dominated Roman intellectual life. Greek art set Roman aesthetic standards. The cultural synthesis that Alexander had initiated continued under Roman rule, spreading to Western Europe and laying foundations for modern Western civilization. The legend of Alexander himself became a powerful cultural force, independent of his actual achievements. The Alexander Romance, a largely fictional account of his adventures, was translated into dozens of languages and spread across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Stories about him influenced medieval literature, inspired countless imitations, and made his name synonymous with military genius and heroic achievement. In the Islamic world, he became Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, mentioned in the Quran and featured in innumerable tales. In Persian literature, he appears as Iskandar, a complex figure both admired and criticized. In India, he remained a reference point for discussing military strategy and cultural exchange. His story transcended the boundaries of any single culture, becoming shared heritage of much of the old world. Military academies still study his battles. His campaigns at the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela are analyzed for their tactical brilliance, their bold innovations, their psychological insight. The hammer and anvil tactics he perfected, fixing the enemy with the phalanx while striking decisively with cavalry, influenced military thinking for 2 millennia. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is simpler and more profound. He proved that with sufficient will, tactical genius, and the loyalty of skilled soldiers, seemingly impossible goals could be achieved. A minor kingdom on the periphery of Greek civilization conquered the greatest empire the world had known. A young man, barely out of adolescence, defeated generals with decades of experience. An army of 40,000 overthrew an empire of millions. This demonstration of human possibility, this proof that extraordinary leadership and unwavering determination could overcome overwhelming odds, inspired generations of ambitious men. It showed that the world was not fixed, that established orders could be overthrown, that empires could be built by those bold enough to attempt it. For better and worse, Alexander's example encouraged countless imitators. Roman generals consciously modeled themselves on him. Napoleon carried a biography of Alexander on his campaigns. Hitler kept his portrait. Every conqueror and would-be world ruler measured himself against Alexander's achievements, asking whether he could match or surpass the Macedonian king. That this legacy included much suffering, many wars, untold Alexander's glory, is undeniable. The cost of empire building is always paid in human lives, in destroyed cities, in cultures obliterated or forced to transform. Alexander's conquests killed hundreds of thousands, displaced entire populations, and erased cultures that can never be recovered. Yet the world he created from that violence endured, evolved, and eventually transformed into something he could not have anticipated. The cultural synthesis he initiated, the networks he established, the ideas he spread, these outlasted the violence and created genuinely new possibilities for human civilization. The ruins of his cities still dot the landscape from Turkey to Afghanistan. The coins bearing his portrait have been found from Britain to India, testimony to how far his influence spread. The Greek sculptures that followed his armies changed how art was made across 3 continents. The administrative systems he established influenced how governments organized themselves for centuries. He was 32 when he died, having ruled for 13 years, having spent less than a decade actually campaigning in Asia. In that brief span, he accomplished more than most men could achieve in 10 lifetimes. He was brilliant, driven, charismatic, and deeply flawed. He could be generous and cruel, wise and foolish, magnanimous, petty, all in the course of a single day. He murdered friends in drunken rages and wept for them afterward. He showed mercy to brave enemies and massacred those who resisted. He spread Greek civilization across the world and destroyed cities that had stood for millennia. He claimed divine ancestry and died from causes as mortal as any peasant's death. He was a hero and a tyrant, a visionary and a destroyer, a man and a myth. Perhaps that complexity, that refusal to be reduced to simple categories of good or evil, hero or villain, is why his story continues to fascinate. He was profoundly human in his contradictions, yet achieved things that seemed superhuman. He was limited by the prejudices and violence of his age, yet transcended them enough to create something genuinely new. The empire he built with force of arms collapsed within a generation. But the empire he built in the minds of those who came after, the vision of possibility, the example of achievement, the ideal of cultural synthesis, this proved far more durable than bronze or stone. Closing. The eternal Alexander. 23 centuries have passed since Alexander died in that palace in Babylon, yet his name still echoes across the world. Children learn of him in history classes, soldiers study his tactics, artists create paintings and films about his life, and historians continue to debate his motivations and achievements. What is it about this young Macedonian king that continues to captivate human imagination? What makes his story timeless, his name synonymous with military genius and heroic achievement? Perhaps it is the sheer scale of what he accomplished in such a brief span. From the moment he became king at 20 until his death at 32, he never lost a battle, never abandoned a campaign, never accepted that anything was beyond his reach. He crossed deserts that had stopped armies before him, climbed mountains that seemed impassable, and defeated enemies that outnumbered him 10 to 1. Kaepernick demonstrated that extraordinary leadership could overcome impossible odds, that tactical brilliance could defeat superior numbers, that unwavering determination could achieve the seemingly unachievable. In an age when we often feel powerless, when systems seem too large to challenge and problems too complex to solve, Alexander's story reminds us that individuals can reshape the world. But his story is not simply about conquest. It is about vision, about seeing beyond the narrow boundaries of one's own culture, about imagining possibilities that others could not conceive. He did not merely conquer cities, he founded new ones, places where cultures could mingle and evolve. He did not simply defeat enemies, he incorporated them into his army, his administration, his vision of what empire could be. His greatest battles were not just against Persian armies or Indian war elephants, but against the limitations of human endurance, the resistance to change, the comfortable certainties of received wisdom. He fought against the prejudice that said Greeks and barbarians could never be equal, against the assumption that empires had natural boundaries, against the idea that certain things were simply impossible. Punished as often as he succeeded, his attempt at cultural fusion was rejected by many of his own followers, and after his death, much of what he tried to create was dismantled. His empire fractured because he failed to create institutions strong enough to survive his death. His relationships were often tragic, marked by violence and betrayal as much as by loyalty and love. Yet even his failures were instructive, demonstrations of what happens when ambition exceeds wisdom, when confidence becomes hubris, when a leader becomes isolated from those he leads. The murder of Clytus, the burning of Persepolis, the catastrophic march through the Gedrosian desert, these remind us that genius does not exempt anyone from human frailty and error. Alexander's story is ultimately about the tension between human potential and human limitations, about how far will and skill can carry us before we encounter boundaries we cannot cross. He pushed those boundaries further than anyone before him, but he could not eliminate them entirely. Even Alexander could not force his exhausted army beyond the Bees River, could not make his body immune to disease, could not make himself truly immortal, no matter how much divine ancestry he claimed. That he came so close, that he achieved so much in such a short time, that his name has survived when most of his contemporaries are forgotten, this is what makes his story eternal. He showed us what is possible while reminding us what is not, inspired us to reach higher while teaching us about the cost of such reaching. Every generation rediscovers Alexander and sees in him what it needs to see. Warriors see the perfect general. Dreamers see the man who believed he could conquer the world and then did. Scholars see the spread of knowledge across cultures. Critics see the cost of empire in human suffering. All these perspectives are valid because Alexander contained multitudes, was complex enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, contradictory enough to resist simple explanation. His bones lie somewhere in Alexandria, if the ancient sources can be believed, though the exact location was lost centuries ago. His empire fragmented and was absorbed by Rome and then by other powers. His conquests were eventually reversed or superseded. But his story, his legend, his example, these remain. We still tell tales of that stormy night in July 356 BC when he was born, of the boy who tamed Bucephalus, of the young king who crossed into Asia with 35,000 men and an unstoppable dream. We still marvel at the battles he won, the distances he traveled, the impossibilities he made real. We still debate whether he was hero or villain, visionary or tyrant, man or god. Perhaps that is the ultimate victory, more complete than his conquest of Persia, more enduring than the Hellenistic kingdoms, that 23 centuries after his death we still care, still wonder, still find meaning in his brief and brilliant life. Alexander wanted immortal glory. He wanted his name to echo through the ages like Achilles and Heracles. He wanted to be remembered not as a man who lived and died, but as a hero who transcended mortality through his achievements. In this, at least, he succeeded completely. His story reminds us that we are capable of extraordinary things, that limitations are often in our minds rather than our circumstances, that bold vision combined with skillful execution can reshape reality. It also reminds us that such achievements come with costs, that glory often rests on tragedy, that the difference between heroism and hubris can be measured in moments. The world Alexander knew is gone. The cities he founded have changed beyond recognition or disappeared entirely. The languages he spoke are dead. The gods he worshipped are forgotten by all but scholars. The empire he built lasted less than a generation in its original form. But the idea of Alexander endures, the possibility he represented, the potential he demonstrated. As long as humans dream of achievement, as long as we push against boundaries and strive for greatness, as long as we believe that individuals can change the world, Alexander's story will resonate. He was born in thunder and lightning, and he lived his entire life at that same intensity, burning bright and fast, consuming everything in his path until the flame finally guttered out. He conquered the world in 12 years, died at 32, and became immortal. Blockers, that is the story of Alexander the Great, a king, a conqueror, a dreamer, a destroyer, a man who reached for godhood and came close enough to blur the boundaries forever. His legacy is written not just in history books, but in the cultural DNA of Western civilization, in every ambitious leader who believes the impossible might be possible, in every general who studies his tactics, in every dreamer who thinks they might change the world. 23 centuries after his death, Alexander still marches through our imaginations, still rides Bucephalus toward the horizon, still demonstrates that human will and vision can reshape reality. The empire he built fell. The empire he inspired will endure as long as humans remember his name and wonder what it means to be truly great. That is his victory, his immortality, his apotheosis. Not as a god, but as an idea, a possibility, a reminder of what we might achieve if we dare to believe that nothing is impossible, that every boundary can be crossed, that glory awaits those brave enough to pursue it. The story began with thunder and lightning. It ends with a name that still echoes across the centuries, a legend that refuses to die, a man who became a myth, and in doing so, became eternal. Commentarios, the Great, the man who conquered the world.